Faiths Seminary International offers a program that focuses on mysticism. It is based on the concept that as we start exploring from an interfaith perspective, all the different paths to God, they start to say the same thing. And it's interesting how the different mystics in the past did what they're doing and what are they doing today? What are modern mystics exploring? In our program, we look at Christian mysticism, Sufism, A Course in Miracles, Zen, Vedanta, Kabbalah, nature mysticism, Sihkism, yoga, and a lot more. We go into a deep dive into all of this. Each level in all three of our programs are designed to help you focus on becoming more aware of how to connect to the divine in perhaps a unique and mystical way. Part of the curriculum is actually the Seeker's Compass, this program right here. And what we find are these amazing, dedicated individuals who've often spent a lifetime using their spiritual map and compass to seek the divine. Their stories are fascinating and their insights are amazingly profound. Today's program is part of that series. And today we're blessed to have Dean Radin with us. And here's our focus on the day. Our map is welcome and introductions. Of course, we'll open with a centering meditation. Dean will share his insights on the illusion of separateness and the illusion of separation. Fascinating concepts. We will have an opportunity to ask questions of Dean and go deeper into his experiences. And hopefully you'll find along the way guidance for your own path, insights into your own experiences, perhaps a little glimpse, a little understanding further into what your awareness is of connecting with all that is. Lots of very, very powerful concepts today. And I'll be introducing Dr. Dean in just a moment. I'm going to ask Dr. Lowenstein to come forward in just a minute and lead us through a guided meditation. Dr. Keith, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. So to get going, this is our usual practice. We spend a few minutes in a centering meditation. So I'm going to invite you all to get comfortable in your seat, but with an upright posture. So if you're in something that's very soft, chair, just move toward the front so you have a little firmer support. So we'd like your pelvis to feel supported underneath you so that your spine can really just rise up out of that. So, just certainly no pain. We're not looking for pain. And if you have to lean against your chair, go ahead. But if you can be free so your ribs can move up and down as you breathe, please do so. So just start by being aware of your breath, being aware of your coccyx and the crown of your head. And just see if you can get a little taller as you breathe. Just keeping that attention on that whole spinal column. And as our posture adjusts to being straighter, let's really settle into the ground below by directing some breaths to your sit bones that are connected to the chair or the pillow or the floor. Just send a breath down there, 2, 3 breaths, trying to connect to the chair, which is connected to the floor and the foundation and the earth. So we're supported. And from that, just enjoy that space. feeling your breath connect you to the ground. When you're ready, open your eyes. And we'll slowly return. Bud will be taking over and introducing us to our special guest, Dean Radin.
Thank you, Keith. That was as always, a lovely meditation. Appreciate that very, very much. Thank you, sir. I would like to introduce Dr. Dean. He is an American scientist known for his innovative experiments and studies and deep research into the areas of consciousness and parapsychological phenomena, paranormal events, psychic insights. And he very clearly in his book, Real Magic, separates the notion of magic for entertainment, for simply the notion of sleight of hand and illusion, and that which is true connectivity to all that is. He's the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences and the author of 9 books. His most popular, Real Magic, I'm actually in the middle of reading, and I find it a complete delight. Dean, we're so delighted to have you here today, and I know that you'll share a little bit of your insight and your mystical path, and we'll have a few questions for you at the end. But whenever you're ready, feel free to take it away.
Thank you, Bud. Here we go. So yes, this is about the illusion of separation. So a little bit about my background. I started playing the violin when I was 5. I was pretty early put on the concert violinist track because I had some talent. When I was 11, I had a full scholarship at the University of Hartford's art school, which is a performing artist conservatory. And for me, it was always very easy to play the violin, so that's why I got shuttled into this, you're going to be a violinist. And after a while, I realized that I'm also interested in other things. Do I have to be a violinist? Well, by the time I got to college, I realized you could do other things. And the main thing is that when I was playing the violin, no one told me that if you're going to do that as a professional, it's essentially being an athlete because you're making your living with your body. And I've never been that robust. I found it easy to play, but if you're playing 4 to 6 hours a day, as we sometimes did, I was exhausted. So I was very happy to learn when I first at the University of Massachusetts, I got a bachelor's in electrical engineering, and then I went on later to the University of Illinois to get a master's in electrical engineering and my doctorate in psychology with a specialty in artificial intelligence. At the time, AI was still fledgling, so the actual work that I was doing was called cybernetics at the time. And in the process of college and graduate school, I realized you could play the violin for fun, but you could actually have a profession that allowed you to sit down and not be an athlete. So that's why I shifted over. So my first real job was at AT&T Bell Labs. My next job, SRI International in Menlo Park, California. And then I was at Princeton for a number of years, and then I went to the University of Edinburgh in Scotland for a number of years, and then Interval Research Corporation, which was a 10-year experiment funded by Paul Allen, who was the co-founder of Microsoft. And it was right at the beginning of when the internet was exploding. And the purpose of Interval was to be the interval between before the internet and after the internet. And so they had a lot of money. And what they did was poach the top people from Apple and Xerox PARC and the MIT Media Lab and a bunch of other places to bring everybody together, about 100 senior people, to invent, as Paul used to say, the wired world. And part of that was to also invent the unwired world, like the early versions of Wi-Fi were invented there. So at all of these places, Each one of these places is pretty conventional, but I was in charge of either full-time or part-time in charge of psychic research programs. It's not generally known that places like this would allow that or even have such things, but they do. For the past 25 years, I've been at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which was started by the Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who was the sixth man on the moon. When Edgar was coming back to the Earth, he had a mystical experience, very classic feeling of unity with the universe. And he was so intrigued by that when he came back to the Earth, he formed the Institute to take the best tools and techniques of science and apply it to things like mystical experience and psychic experience. And that's what we've been doing for 50 years now. I'm also a professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies, which is an accredited graduate school. And in all of these places now, if I look back for 45 years, my primary job has been to study psychic phenomena. So over the years, I've given lots of talks. These are a sprinkling of universities you'll recognize. Harvard at the medical school, Stanford in the statistics department, Columbia in the education department, Cambridge University in the physics department. This is University of Padua, which is where Galileo was, also in physics department, and University of Allahabad. What I'm talking about here is the philosophy department and also the cognitive neuroscience department. So these are the kinds of universities and departments that are interested in the kind of work that I do. That too is not generally known, that lots of universities, lots of people in the academic world are interested in these kinds of phenomena, because if you go to places like Wikipedia and you learn about these things, you'll find uniformly negative responses and articles which are written by people who don't know what they're talking about. I've also given talks to quite a few ashrams, the Brahmakumaris, the Sivananda. This one, the Svyasa, is the Swami Vivekananda University in India. It's near Bangalore. And in India, you can be an ashram, an Ayurvedic hospital, and an accredited university, all kind of wrapped in one. So I was there for a while, and it's such a joy to talk to people there as compared to these other universities, because they're already, the culture is so different, and they're so interested in seeing that science is interested in what they do and within an ashram, that it's a much more pleasant time to talk to those folks. I've also been asked to talk to the military and intelligence world, and also the National Academy of Sciences. That too is not generally known, but there are a lot of people in those worlds that are interested in it. In fact, one day I gave a talk at the Brahmakumaris Peace Village in Massachusetts, and later in the day I gave a talk at the Naval War College in Rhode Island. So I went from peace to war on that day. I've given talks to industries like Google and pharmaceutical company Merck, and Johnson & Johnson and a number of others, including banks for some reason. The ADC Forum is, it's the Australian Davos connection. So Davos, you may remember, is where the Economic Forum is, and each country has their own version of that. So I went to Australia and gave talks to government ministers there. So the interesting story there is, among the ministers, one of them is the Minister for Indigenous People. And so I gave this long talk about telepathy, and afterwards she came up and said, well, we've known this for 3,000 years. And I said, yeah, I know that, but from a scientific perspective, we're just beginning to understand not only that it exists, but understand a little bit about it. So she smiled and said, very good. eCliff is a banking, it's the government bank in Malaysia. So they invited me to a whole bunch of different TV shows around the world. So when I was working at SRI International, it was a classified program by the US government, now popularly known as Project Stargate, which was using psychic phenomena for espionage. So espionage, capital ESP, espionage. What I'm currently doing besides all of that, I co-founded a company called Cognigenics, which is creating a new class of therapeutics for psychiatric disorders, initially focusing on mild cognitive impairment, dementia, and Alzheimer's, and specifically targeting memory. So we have figured out a way of using genetic engineering, primarily RNA interference methods, to downregulate the inflammation in the hippocampus, which is one of the reasons why memory starts to fail as we get older. This reduces that inflammation, and memory improves by 100% so far in animal studies. So we're raising money at this point to do clinical trials that will begin, we think, about halfway through this year, sometime in the summer, if we get the money. The other thing I'm doing is working on a new TV series, maybe Netflix, maybe HBO. We don't know exactly which one yet. But I'm working with a producer in Hollywood who's fabulously interested in all this stuff. And we're making a fictional episodic series based on Stargate, because there's lots and lots of stories about what it's like to work in a classified environment doing this sort of thing, some of which has not been declassified, but I can fictionalize events that happened, which we think would be interesting for a fictional series. So I should have been retired a long time ago. I'm 72, and that's old enough to be retired, but somehow none of these people are letting me retire, so okay. So what is reality? Reality is what I perceive, isn't it? Well, not exactly. The easy way to see that is through visual illusions. So when you look at this, it looks pretty clear that this top part of this picture is dark gray and the bottom is light gray, except that's actually not the case. What we can do is start covering pieces of this. It's the original picture. I'm just going to put black bars to cover the background. And when you do that, you see that the gray is actually exactly the same color. So the reason why it looks that way is because the brain has learned that when you see certain shadows like this and edges, that the brain fills in the rest of the color. And so it takes masking to actually see that the color is the same in this case. This one's quite strange. So you keep your eye right here in this cross. And now if through your peripheral vision, you can see distorted faces of people. But if you then look at those faces, they're perfectly normal faces. And you go back and look in the center, those same faces become highly distorted. Well, why is that? It's because we resolve things with the fovea, which is, if you're looking at the cross in the center, your fovea gets high resolution there, but your peripheral vision's only getting little pieces of it, and your brain is constructing what it thinks it's seeing, and it's seeing distorted faces. So that one's kind of a strange illusion. Here's another one. This looks like a perfectly nice Rubik's Cube, but it's actually just a flat drawing. So showing the illusion of perspective when you're looking at a 3D object in 2D. Here's another one. This is an artistic piece. Depending on your perspective, you can see very different things. And this one, the boxes look like they're marching down, like stepping down, but actually they're not. Especially there, they look like that, but it's because of the background. We're influenced by the background, and they're actually moving exactly at the same time. And likewise, in this one, I could ask you to count the number of dark spots, and you can't, because the dark spots aren't actually there. It looks like it's there from your peripheral vision, but when you start looking for them, they disappear. So again, it's a difference between what your fovea can see versus what your peripheral vision can see. And this is my favorite one. So here, nice three ladies. We'll turn the picture upside down. Oops, something's not right. Well, why are they not right? It's because when you're looking at it this way, your brain's constructing, oh, these are people, these are faces. It's very difficult to see. Now that you look at it, you can see that the eyes and the mouth actually are the right side up. But your body, your brain is telling you that the body is the wrong way. And so you construct it correctly in your mind, but that's not what's happening. So what this tells us, and there are hundreds and hundreds of examples of this, not only with visuals, but with auditory illusions and many other kinds of illusions, including physical illusions in your body. Subjective and objective realities are not the same. We see what we expect to see, and much of this is unconscious and much of it is driven by the brain. So a philosopher will call that naive reality. Naive reality is a very thin slice of reality with a big R. Well, then what's real reality? Well, we have a clue from physics. One of the puzzles in physics is that we live in the classical world, our everyday world. We'd call it classical physics, but we know through the advancements in physics that there's a quantum world as well, and they're really different. Our everyday world, we have concepts like locality, causality, a fixed reality, and space-time. That's what our everyday senses tell us. The quantum world is the complete opposite. It's non-locality, acausal, a participatory reality, and there is no space-time. So the one of the puzzles then in physics, well, how do we get from what we think of as deep physical reality into the everyday world? And that transition is not well understood. So that's the world of separation that we live in every day. But what we can say is a deeper reality, there is no separation at all. And of course, this is where mystics live. Mystics either know intellectually or experientially that there really is no separation in space or time or any other way. There are other hints about real reality. So you can put it on this graph where you see the impact of an experience and how frequently they occur. So for example, and the impact is mundane to profound, frequency is common to rare. So things like gut feelings or hunches or insights, basically everybody reports those occasionally. And then things like the feeling of being stared at, telephone telepathy, distant knowing, distant healing, premonitions, creative insight, religious epiphany, full mystical union. So who has these things? Well, in the lower left, everybody at one point or another is reporting this sort of thing. And then we call people healers and intuitives and geniuses, prodigies, saints, and yogis. All of this is what I would call the extended capacities of the mind. So for reasons I don't completely understand, I've always been interested in this spectrum. So these phenomena, especially in the upper right, seem strange for one reason only. They suggest that mind transcends time and space. So it's not like the everyday world. We don't have that feeling, but that's what they suggest. So we don't question that there was Mozart or there was Einstein. They're very rare people, but they're beyond the reach of science. We don't know how to explain genius, but they're also well accepted because we know these people existed. On the other hand, these phenomena down here are commonly reported, easy to study, but they're considered highly controversial. So some paradox right from the get-go. So we're talking about a whole range of anomalies of human experience, and they're called anomalies because science does not yet know how to deal with it. So it's genius, acquired savants, autistic savants, dissociative identity disorder used to be called multiple personality, and my main focus is on psychic phenomena. So we're talking about telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, psychokinesis. We believe that they're all the same underlying phenomena and that these are just labels for how these experiences manifest, how they are experienced. And then there's a whole other class of phenomena suggested of survival of consciousness after bodily death. So the labels we give: telepathy, mind-to-mind connections; psychokinesis is intention impressed into the world; clairvoyance is information from the world getting into your mind; and precognition is that, except slipped in time. We call it psi, which is just the first letter in the Greek word psyche, meaning mind or soul. Why would we want to study this? Well, because it's a major challenge to the scientific status quo. It can be rigorously studied using scientific methods, and it suggests that consciousness, whatever else it might be, is non-local. And they're extremely common. So we did a survey among psychic enthusiasts, people who have these experiences or are interested in them, and also the general population, and then scientists and engineers from elite universities. And we gave them a list of 25 different experiences. Not what do you believe, but have you ever experienced this? 25 different things, all of which are various kinds of psychic phenomena, but without using that term. And said, oh, how many of these have you experienced? And so psychic enthusiasts, not surprisingly, 99% of them have experienced at least one of the 25 phenomena, and 13 on average. So we'd kind of expect that. The general population, 94%, 7.7. The surprise was that scientists and engineers said 93% of scientists and engineers at elite universities, mostly Ivy League, but also in other countries, had experienced at least one psychic phenomena, and on average, 8.7. So these are very common. There are mundane explanations for some of this. A lot of it is coincidence. Some of it is confabulation. Some of it is fraud. Some of it is selective memory. There's always something left over. And so I'm interested in what's left over. That's where science comes in, because science is really good at figuring out, how do we explain this? And if we have no other explanation, we end up in that nice spot. So let's look at one of the many ways that we study telepathy in the laboratory. So the method is called the Ganzfeld, which is a German word. It means whole field. And you take a person who will play the role of the telepathic receiver, you sit them down in a comfy chair, you shine a red light on them, and you take a ping pong ball and you cut it in half and you put it over each eye. You ask them to keep their eyes open. So in that position, you can imagine that everywhere you look, all you can see is a pink light. And after a few minutes, your brain gets tired of that, and it makes it much, much easier to visualize. At the same time, you're wearing headphones that play white noise, and so your brain gets tired of hearing nothing, and so you can also visualize auditory information. It's like you're in a dream state. You can get there in 15 minutes or so. So while you're resting in that state, you have a distant person who we'll call the sender, who is given a randomly selected image out of a very large pool of images. And that person is asked, okay, take that image, put it in your mind, and send it to the receiver, who's isolated by shielding and distance. And so with any luck, both people will be thinking about rabbits at the same time. So in the actual experiment, let's say we have it set up, we're going to use an elephant as the target, put the elephant in the other person's mind, and we ask the receiver to speak aloud any impression that they get. So if you're lucky, they'll say something like, well, I think it's an animal and it's gray. Maybe that's all that they get. They speak aloud because we record what they said. Because when you're in this Ganzfeld state, it's a little bit like a dreamy state. And even though you're talking aloud, when you come out of that state, it's really hard to remember what you said and what your impressions were. So in a real experiment, we take the person out of the Ganzfeld state and then we play back anything that they said, and we show them 4 pictures, one of which was the actual target, and then 3 decoys. So these pictures are chosen so they're different from each other's as much as possible. And you can see then by the way this is set up that on average, people would get the right choice 1 in 4 times. If telepathy did not exist, the best you could do was get a 1 in 4 chance. So we've done these experiments in lots of different contexts. And this one, this is a 2,000-pound solid steel double-walled electromagnetically shielded chamber in our lab. When you put somebody in there and close the door, the outside world is acoustically and electromagnetically very seriously attenuated. So they're pretty much isolated. In this experiment I'm about to show, the receiver is in that box. It's 8 by 8 by 8 feet in size, so it doesn't feel too claustrophobic. And the sender is in another part of the building upstairs. So they're pretty far separated from each other. So here's my friend Gail, who's one of those natural psychics. We put the ping pong balls over her eyes, and she's in the Ganzfeld condition. She sat there for about 15 minutes, and then the sending period began. So these were the 4 targets that were created beforehand. One of these 4 would be randomly selected and given to the sender. And the sender in this case was a contractor who was working for Gail, putting up or refurbishing a garage. So she had just met him, but she is so telepathic that she basically has said, you could select anybody that I know as being the sender, and I'll see what I can do. So this was her contractor who thought this was all a bunch of nonsense, but he was willing to go along and play the game. So a random decision was made. One of these 4 images he was sending to her. And this is what she said. Something has a rough texture, tall, looking up high, like in an art gallery or in a museum, a Yosemite kind of image of a tall rock, monolithic, images of Mount Rushmore, half dome, like a big stone. So then she was taken out of the Ganzfeld state, shown these 4 pictures and said, well, given your impressions, which one of these 4 do you think matched your impression? So she's quite good at what she does, and not surprisingly, she selected that. And that was, in fact, the image that her contractor was sending her from a distant place in the building. So that's one session of this type of experiment. It takes about 90 minutes. There's at least 3 people involved. It's very complicated, and you get 1 data point. So Skeptic Dog says, well, are these experiments independently repeatable? I just showed you one of them. So where have they been repeated? Well, they've been repeated in lots of universities and private institutes around the world for a long time. And when you look at the published data, it's 122 experiments reported from 20 labs around the world and 4,674 sessions of the type where I just demonstrated the one with Gail. So lots and lots of sessions. You can imagine the number of people and the amount of time it took to develop all this data. And so here's chance at 25%, and you can kind of eyeball it and see that overall it's actually above 25%. Well, how much? So you can, since every one of these experiments is basically the same design, you can just say, well, let's put it all together so it's one gigantic experiment with 4,674 sessions. And so now it's easier to see that if chance is 25% over here, we're ending up at around 32%. That's where the current estimate is of what people can do in this experiment. The odds against chance of being there rather than chance is 300 trillion quadrillion to 1. It's 10 to the minus 30th. That means it's not going to happen by chance. So the other thing is that because we have so much data now that we know that this effect from an experimental perspective is stable, meaning it hasn't changed in about 20 years. We can keep doing this experiment again and again and again. It's not this effect is a real effect. It means that rather than having hit rates at 25% chance, it's about 1 in 3, 32% or 33%. That means information is getting from one person's mind to the next. This has been discussed many times in one of the top academic psychology journals, again and again and again, sometimes presenting data, and then there's a skeptic who will say, well, did you think of this? And we present more data. They said, did you think of this? Back and forth, back and forth. So if the odds are 300 trillion quadrillion to 1, what that says is it would take longer than the lifetime of the universe to get these results by pure chance. if you simply add up how much time did it take to collect all this, multiply by 300 trillion quadrillion, it's way longer than multiple universes. So this is not chance. Then people say, well, maybe there was some kind of leakage of the information or a recording mistake or on and on and on, all kinds of possibilities to explain this through mundane means. And the one we couldn't answer until fairly recently was, well, if a skeptic who really doesn't believe in any of this stuff, if they replicate this experiment, what do they get? Well, in 2005, there was an actual pair of psychologists who explicitly said they didn't believe in any of this, but they did the experiment anyway. And they said in the article, after 8 studies, we had an overall statistically significant hit rate of 32%, which is what everyone else has seen. But they didn't like that. So they said, well, this is precariously close to demonstrating humans do have psychic powers. They were not happy with that result, but to their credit, they reported it anyway. So this has been reviewed many, many times. If you know about statistics, here's the Ganzfeld state. It's 19 standard errors from chance. If you prefer Bayes factors, it's something like 18 million. What is this? 18 million to 1. So lots of different techniques have been used to evaluate this data. And journals like Frontiers in Psychology are a very mainstream journal. So again, this is being discussed in the academic world. Even prominent skeptics, like Richard Wiseman is a well-known skeptic in the UK, if you're familiar with the data, something's happening. He said, I think that these studies do meet the usual standards for a normal claim. But that said, he still doesn't believe in psychic phenomena because we don't have a positive definition of psychic phenomena yet. In order to have a positive definition saying, well, this is why it happened, we need an explanation. And so far, science hasn't gotten there. We know that it exists, but we don't have a good explanation. So we can then look at this in a slightly different way. I've already said that we are looking at a 32% hit rate. It's wildly significant. If we look at this from the point of view of people who report these experiences, so these are artists, writers, musicians, and psychics who report these kinds of phenomena. So this very same experiment, you get a 41% hit rate. With only 367 sessions, you still end up with odds of 10 billion to 1. So when you're working with people who have some familiarity and talent for telepathy, they do way better than the average person, because these people in these other studies were not selected for any particular ability. We've done this study also by looking at correlations in brain activity. You can take 2 people, isolate them, do a stimulus on one of them, and the other person's brain will jump. The brain correlation, including not only with EEG, but also functional MRI, and we can see where in the brain the other person's is responding. The receiver's brain will light up in specific areas. So let's switch over to precognition. So I call this presentiment because it's a perception through time, but it's not cognizing it. It's not knowing what's going to happen. It's feeling what's going to happen. So presentiment. So we take a physiological measure or a bunch of measures. We create a random decision. We show a picture which is either calm or a picture which is emotional. And the idea is that if your mind is actually extended through time, that if you're about to see this image, your physiology will be pretty calm. But if you're about to see that image, your physiology is going to start to gear up in anticipation. So one of the first versions of this that I ran was using skin conductance, because it's very easy to measure. It's a good reflector of what's going on in your autonomic nervous system. So the screen is blank. You press a button, screen remains blank for 5 seconds. At that point, the computer does a random decision to select a photo out of a large pool of photos. Some are calm, some are emotional. So you might have a picture of a bunny or a picture of a snake. Stays on the screen for 3 seconds, and then the screen goes blank again for 10 seconds. And then you repeat this 30 to 40 times. So this is what you get at this kind of experiment. So here's the stimulus where the picture shows up. So what you're looking at is what happens if the picture happens to be calm? Well, skin conductance remains calm, rises a little bit because there's a little bit of anticipation. You didn't quite know what you're going to see. But if it's an emotional picture, boom, your sweat glands are activated in your palm and your fingers, and you get this big rise. What's happening beforehand? Well, that's what's happening beforehand. The average before the emotional picture, you begin to become aroused. And before the calm picture, you remain calm. And so this difference is what I call the presentiment effect. It's that difference. So this has been done in many, many different contexts in the brain and other aspects of the body. In this case, very simply, press a button, 4 seconds later, you either see a light flash or not. It's randomly determined. And then a little bit later, you get a tone like a click, which tells you that this session is over. And when you're ready, you press the button again. So we did 100 trials per person, 13 females, 7 males. And this is just an overall average brain response. So when you get a flash, there's a huge response. No flash, there's no response. And beforehand, you get this difference, which turns out to be quite significant. We've done it with pupil dilation, where we're able to track not only where the person is looking, but also the size of their pupil. Do the same kind of thing. Emotional targets, you get a big rise in pupil dilation, and calm targets, you get a small rise. During this 3-second period, the screen is blank. So there's no reason why your pupil would move according to light. It can only move because of something like an emotional response. And as you see, the moment that the trial begins, the pupils begin to dilate before the emotional picture. And the colleagues have replicated this too. It's quite significant. We've done this in long-term meditators. So we got 8 meditators, each had at least 20 years experience of a non-dual form of meditation, like Dzogchen. And 8 controls. People had no experience with meditation at all. And the task was very simple. We're recording 32 channels of EEG, and at random times, they would either see a very tiny light flash or a very mild tone. And the way that we provided this is they would wear glasses that had little LED in the glasses, or they'd wear earbuds to hear the tone. And it's very, very mild because we didn't want to disrupt the meditative state. So that was the design. So this went on for 20 minutes with these kinds of stimuli. So this is the EEG of the controls and of the meditators. And so the green is the light flash, the red is the audio tone, and you get responses as you would expect in the body. And the same with meditators. It's not quite as big because meditators tend to be more chill. So controls them beforehand, 2 seconds before, showed no difference in their brain response before these 2 phenomena or 2 stimuli, and meditators did. So about a second and a half, their brains are already responding differentially according to their future experience. So the reason we use these long-term meditators because meditators with enough experience will often report 2 things. They'll talk about spaciousness, a feeling that their location is expanded through space, but they'll also talk about timelessness, where their feeling of the present moment expands through time. So we were interested as well, is that just their subjective feeling, or is it ontologically measurable? And this result shows it is ontologically the case. Like it is really the case that some aspect of their awareness is spread out through space and time. So here's the pre-stimulus period, and there you go. So this has been published in many, many, many times. These are studies we did, but lots of other people did as well. As usual, we go through a long due diligence list to find out, is this a mistake? Is it an artifact? Can we believe the results? So we go through this long list of things. We have good reasons to believe that it is not any of these artifacts. So the underlying question always in science is, well, is it independently repeatable? Well, so here's a colleague in the Netherlands who did a functional MRI test, and he's showing here this pink curve is an emotional picture, and the blue is a calm picture, and it shows the effect shows up, the differential effect shows up in the brain, in the amygdala, which is the portion of the brain that processes emotion. So, yeah, the effect is real, and we can see where it's happening in the brain. Here's Ronald McCready from the Institute of Heart Math. That institute focuses on issues of the heart. So he used heart rate as the measure. Before meditation, after meditation, emotional and calm images, huge differences here, statistically undeniable effects. So this has been reported in Frontiers in Psychology, which again is one of the top-rated psychology journals. It's been viewed 98,000 times, actually more recently over 100,000 times, which is astonishing for any article. And it says here, the article has more views than 99% of all Frontiers articles, and actually even 99% more than any academic journal in psychology. So people are very interested in this, and this is a meta-analysis talking about all of the studies that have been done looking at this. And then later, we reported an update a couple of years later, again, a very popular article. 40 studies of this have been done, 1978 to 2011, combined odds against chance, 602 billion to 1. So this is a real effect. I presented this at a physics symposium, AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science, at the University of San Diego, and again in 2011. These are physicists, mainstream physicists, interested in the nature of time, and in particular, anomalies of time, which we might say are retrocausal effects. We know it occurs in the quantum world. The fact that it occurs in human physiology is, of course, of very high interest to them. This was brought up to date in 2018 with now over 4 dozen experiments like this, and the findings reported in the earlier meta-analysis are confirmed. So this is a repeatable effect. It's one of the easiest effects to repeat because when a person is involved in this experiment, you're not asking them to do anything other than to look at pictures. And meanwhile, we're using their physiology to get their unconscious response to a future event. So Skeptic Cat says, well, wait a minute, we're talking about perceptions that are unlimited by space and time? Well, so we go to experts in evaluating data, like statisticians. So here's my friend Jessica Utz, who I've known since at least 1980, maybe before. She, in 2016, was the president of the American Statistical Association and has also been interested in these psi experiments. So she said, as part of her presidential address, to the collected statisticians of the world, the data in support of precognition and possibly other related psychic phenomena are quite strong statistically and would be widely accepted if they pertain to something more mundane. What that tells us is that because science has not yet caught up with a satisfactory explanation for these phenomena, they're considered highly controversial. But if you only look at the data, there's no question that these things would be completely acceptable. In 2018, Ethel Cardinia, who's a professor at Lund University in Sweden, wrote this major review for American Psychologists, which is the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association. He said the evidence for psi is comparable to that for established phenomena in psychology and other disciplines, no doubt. So why is this controversial? It's controversial because the current theory in science is a materialistic theory, and it gives rise to ideas within the neurosciences that you are your brain. As Francis Crick said, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. And as Marvin Minsky said, you're a machine made of meat. That is the prevailing view within the neurosciences. It is still true. It's changing, but that has been the story for 100 years. The second theory is the esoteric the esoteric theory, which is consciousness is fundamental. From a philosophical perspective, this is somewhere between panpsychism and idealism and dual aspect monism and other terms like that. As far as I can tell, these phenomena that we're talking about are much more easy to explain through theory 2 than theory 1. In fact, theory 1, people are completely stuck on this. You cannot explain unless the brain is operating in a quantum fashion. And there's now rising evidence that the brain actually does operate in a quantum fashion, in which case the brain is capable of things that we were not aware of until recently. So a conventional scientist who doesn't know about this literature will say that nothing about the extraordinary capacities of consciousness makes any sense at all because they're coming from a materialistic perspective. Unless consciousness in some way is fundamental. So again, skeptic Cat says, well, why isn't this part of the scientific mainstream? The data is very clear. Well, there's long-term stigma and taboo. There are scientific objections, there are religious objections. Basically, there's a lot of pressure to say no. There's belief among many scientists that the phenomena are literally impossible. They say that the positive experiments could only be due to flaws or fraud. It amounts to a kind of a willful ignorance because it's not as though the information isn't available, but major changes are underway. Like huge changes are happening in science because younger people are coming along and they're much more familiar with quantum mechanics and they're interested in these kinds of phenomena. Well, why is it important to study any of this stuff? Well, because the scientific worldview today, materialism, overlooks very important aspects of reality. So it fails to answer probably the most critical question any of us could ask, which is, who are we? Or what's our potential? Those questions, science is very severely limited because of the philosophy of materialism. As I said, change is coming. You find thought leaders now in many areas of science saying, maybe we didn't have this quite right. And it's a reconsideration of materialism as a philosophy. So myself and my colleagues are like Alice in the Wonderland. We're pulling back the veil of reality, or at least pulling back the veil that prevents us from seeing reality. And we're seeing the matrix behind there and trying to understand how it works. Because at this point, we already know that it's there, but we don't know, a little bit like in the movie The Matrix, the people involved inside the matrix, it's very difficult to understand the nature of the matrix. And the way it's presented in that film is through a metaphor of a computer that's controlling everything. And I think it's much more interesting than that. So you find all the way back to the origins of quantum mechanics that most of the founders of quantum mechanics were philosophical idealists. So like Eddington said, it's difficult for the matter-of-fact physicists to accept the view that the substratum of everything is of mental character. Almost all of the founders had the same idea. They were part of the German idealist movement at the time. So one of the reasons I mention this is because we might say that, well, physicists couldn't possibly come up with quantum mechanics if they were idealists, because that accepts that everything, the real fundamental is consciousness, not the physical world. And yet the reason why quantum mechanics arose was because of the mystical tendencies and interests of those founders of quantum mechanics. So in 2005, in Nature, #1 scientific journal in the world, they had this essay, The Mental Universe, the only reality is mind and observations. But observations are not of things. To see the universe as it really is, we must abandon our tendency to conceptualize observations as things. And a very similar thing, physicists shy from the truth because the truth is so alien to everyday physics. The universe is entirely mental. The fact that this showed up as an essay in Nature is one of the ways of seeing that the materialistic paradigm, even at the very top edge of science today, is beginning to recognize that maybe thinking of the world only in terms of matter and energy is simply not sufficient. And you see this now in Scientific American a couple of years ago, and many, many other things like this, a primary role for mind in nature. So I'm going to end my slides there. And now we can chat. I see, oh good, there's some chatting that's been going on.
Yes, there's been a number of comments in chat. Dean, thank you for that. That was absolutely wonderful and amazing. We really appreciate the fact that you are giving voice to something that many of us have experienced for most of our lives, one way or another. That's the folks that are attracted to this particular group, the Seeker's Compass, I have found to be the ones that are really interested in consciousness and understanding our consciousness and our connection to divine consciousness. And where does that begin? Where does that end? Does it? And how are we all connected? And it is interesting to see where science in this particular realm is lagging very, very far behind, because science is supposed to be leading us, and yet that's not the case in this particular instance.
Well, science is definitely leading in the physical world. That right? Science is lagging behind in the subjective world. And of course, one of the things that this kind of phenomena are showing is that there isn't really a strong difference. There's no strong separation between subjective and objective. That's one of the stories that comes out of this kind of research, that there's subjective and objective that blur together in ways. So one of the reasons I got interested in magic and traditional esoteric magic is by realizing that the kinds of phenomena that I study are exactly the same as what esoteric magic is all about. So
fascinating.
As I write in my book, Real Magic, the idea of enchantment in traditional magic is what we would call a psychokinetic effect in parapsychology, mind-matter interaction. Divination, in the magical terms, would be precognition, clairvoyance, and so on, telepathy. And theurgy in magic, which has to do with spirits, is what we would call the realm of research on survival, which includes things like out-of-body experience and near-death experience and all of the rest of those phenomena. So from a modern scientific spin and an ancient magical spin, they're both pointing at the same stuff in slightly different ways.
Mm-hmm.
In the ancient world, if you wanted to become a magician, you probably could if you could find somebody willing to teach you and not be killed by the Inquisition at the same time. In today's world, we don't have that risk, but we do have a similar risk in that you will be essentially burnt if you're trying to do this in the academic world, because the academic world is still more or less stuck in a materialistic paradigm, and there's enormous inertia. It's very difficult to change those paradigms. But as I said, the reason why I have a new book coming out, it's later this year, is to point out that there's a re-enchantment of the world that's happening even in the academic world. And give a bunch of examples of how we know that that's happening. That means that eventually, a generation or two from now, that the kinds of phenomena that I'm talking about here will be considered so vanilla and elementary that people will wonder, like younger people will wonder back at that time, why was this even considered to be controversial? They won't know anymore. And at the same time, the idea that we have the capacity to do magic, traditional kinds of magic, will also be seen as, well, okay, what else is new? You know, we see that even in social media now, that there's talks about drones flying in the air and UFOs and all of this stuff. And the comments to these kinds of reports are really funny, because they're either people respond to it and say, well, does that mean I need to pay my rent on Monday? If the aliens are here, do I have to pay rent? And the other thing is that it's this, well, of course it is. Well, we've known this for a long time. What's the big deal?
Right.
So
Right.
society and science and knowledge marches on.
How long is that going to take? What do you think? A couple hundred years before we get to that norm?
No, it's going to
No.
happen much faster now. The social
Ah,
media has accelerated everything
that's true.
enormously.
Yes.
And so one of the reasons why I was contacted by this TV series producer was that he recognizes, as many people in Hollywood do, that the zeitgeist is changing when it comes to UFOs. It's changing very recently because of a podcast called the Telepathy Tapes, which has demonstrated to a lot of people, to their satisfaction, that severely autistic people who are nonverbal, who don't have very well control of their body and can't speak, that nevertheless, when they learn how to type, that they appear to be highly telepathic. So the podcast goes through that in some detail, and I know the people have been working on that. The nature of the data from a scientific perspective is, I would say, intriguing. It's not perfect yet because there's still a number of questions involved. But if any of that is even close to true, the response to the podcast is really interesting. 90 million people have
Wow.
downloaded that podcast. That means that the society is ready for this, right? We're open to it. We're interested in it. So that and UFOs and a few other things and declassified information from the old Stargate program lends itself to a new kind of X-Files show. So the reason why I was brought in as a consultant on this project is because the producer has had these experiences, like many of us have, and wants to present as credible a scientific slant on this. At the same time, it has to be entertaining. So that's a tension that I'm going to have to deal with as the script consultant. And so
Right.
he wrote the pilot script, and I gave a whole bunch of comments, usually along the lines of this is not the way things work. This is probably not real. And he accepted most of my comments. It changed the script, and we're not finished with it yet, but we're going to work on it still. So we hope that kind of a show will both entertain people but also educate them. That's what my interest is. Educate them so people can see that, yeah, science knows that some of this is real, and this is how we study it. And if we then project in a science fiction fashion, where's this going to go and what it would look like, it can make quite an interesting show. So, I mean, and entertaining at the same time. So that's what we're aiming towards.
I'm looking forward to watching that. That sounds terrific.
Yeah. So I asked the producer, I'm not an actor, so I can't be in the show and I wouldn't want to be, but can I be like somebody in the crowd? I can do like a cameo thing where I can be somebody working on a computer in the background. I said, yeah, sure, you can do that.
That's funny. That's good. That's good. Dean, you already have demonstrated that you've got a wonderful sense of humor. So I'm sure that you can intertwine that as you go through your work.
I hope so.
I don't know if Keith or John have any comments or questions that they would like to ask. We've got some comments and questions in chat. We'll come to those in just a minute. Keith, is there anything you'd like to ask or share?
Yeah, Dean, how do you view this from an evolutionary standpoint and also from a skills learning perspective? So do you think that, I mean, how long do you think Homo sapiens have been able to do this? Do you think always? Do you think there's ongoing, evolution in our central, obviously there's ongoing evolution in our central nervous system, but are we moving that way? And what about, teaching people to be more facile with these aspects of a human ability?
Yeah, I think that we have been shaped by evolution to ignore these phenomena. A small percentage of the population has these abilities to a high extent, and they have not lost it. But most people, 80, 90% of people, have the capacity, but they've blocked it. And it's been shaped by evolution for a very obvious reason, that if you're able to pay attention to what's happening on Pluto a billion years ago with your consciousness, the tiger's going to eat you and your branch of the tree is gone. On
Oops.
the other hand, you do want a few people in your tribe, the shamans, who were able to do this because we're hungry. Where are the animals we need to go hunt for? Well, so they have the capacity to be able to do this, but they don't have the capacity to take care of themselves very well because the universe is inside their head. So every tribe would have at least one shaman. They would take care of them and then use that person to gain information to be able to survive. In today's world, a combination of huge number of distractions, just the distractions of having a life, combined with especially today with television and social media and all the rest of it, it's very, very easy to forget all of that. So if you're one of those 90% of the people whose this has been trained out of, both through, I think, genetically part of it, part of distraction, all the rest, how could you get back to that? The easiest and time-honored way is meditation.
Yeah.
We've tested with people who are beginning meditation and people who are long-term meditators and gave them a battery of questions about their experiences. And the long-term meditators, the majority of them say that they experience these things usually as synchronicities, but they happen pretty frequently. And sometimes it advances into things like precognition and so on. For beginning meditators too, it doesn't take long. It's sometimes a month or two before they start getting synchronicities popping up all the time. Well, what is the synchronicity? It's some kind of, I would say, a vanilla form of psychic phenomena where part of their unconscious mind, which is constantly scanning everything all the time, arranges for them to be at places which they want to be at or experience something that they want to, and it's just not quite conscious yet, but it's unconsciously there and it arranges for that outcome. In the more advanced stages, you can arrange for those kinds of events. I mean, somewhere between a perceptual psychic event and a psychokinetic thing that would happen. And so the way I look at it, the experiments that we run in the laboratory are paradoxically an arranged synchronicity. The results of the experiments are correlations, essentially. That's what any kind of experiment is. We see a correlation. We do this and that happens, but we arrange for it. And that's why I have this feeling that even spontaneous synchronicities are ultimately a psychic event.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree.
It's interesting. In one of our studies, in A Course in Miracles, it says very clearly there are no such things as coincidences.
Yeah. Well, there really can be real coincidences. I think that the physical world allows that. But when we're involved, especially if it's perceived as a meaningful coincidence, that's different.
Right.
Right. So the science takes advantage of all kinds of random events for simulation and other things. Most of that looks really, really random from a statistical point of view until you introduce a human and then suddenly it stops behaving randomly. So I'll give you an example.
Slit experiment, right?
Excuse me?
The slit experiment.
Yes, but that's a more sophisticated version of what I'm about to describe. So you take something like a random number generator. I think I have one over here somewhere. Like this. So this is a quantum-based random number generator. It's Quantus. So the way it works is there's a half-silvered mirror inside of it and a device that shoots single photons at it. And the photon is shot at the half-silvered mirror from we know from a quantum mechanical sense that it will either pass through or it'll bounce off. And then there are detectors. So going through or bouncing off is essentially yes, no. It's like a 0 and 1 bit. And then there's other there are other aspects of the electronics that guarantee that it has the same number of zeros and ones and that they're independent from each other. So it's a really, really good random number generator because what causes a photon to go through or bounce off is considered within quantum mechanics to be completely random. It's as though the photon, when given no other instructions, it doesn't care. Sometimes they'll go through this way and sometimes that way. But you take this sort of a thing and you tell somebody to make more 1 bits come out of it, you can actually bias the result and it will start producing more 1s. And the same for zeros. So that this kind of study has been in the lab for about 50 years, hundreds of replications. There's no doubt that that happens. So that tells us that it's true that there's something about randomness when you bring in what we can say is, I'm going to put in quotes, a higher consciousness, because I actually think that the photons have a proto-consciousness, that the things begin to behave differently because now the photons have a meaning. You've injected meaning into the system of U plus random number generator. Photons somehow respond to that, and so the output changes. So one of the big projects we've been working on now for 28 years, continually, is called the Global Consciousness Project. So we're looking at if we have a lot of evidence that all the stuff I'm talking about is sort of one person and one target system. What if you are dealing with 7 or 8 billion people around the world during special events where everyone's minds are in coherence because they're paying attention to that one thing? So just recently, I'm finishing this paper now, I looked at the worldwide network of random number generators that we've been running for 28 years, things kind of like this. And we run it continuously so that if an event occurs of interest, that we can go look at the data, the random data, and see, is it still acting randomly or not? So I used New Year's Eve celebrations in each time zone around the world, including the half time zone. India is off by a half an hour, and there's a bunch of other countries that are off by a little bit. So I collected the stroke of midnight in 1 hour. So the center of an hour was the stroke of midnight in each one of these time zones. And so because we have 28 years of this, there's a lot of data. And so you create the ensemble average of all of this, and you say, well, how did the randomness work? And what you see is a line that starts at the beginning of like half an hour before midnight, sort of going along like this, and suddenly boom and boom at midnight. Very significant difference, a 7 sigma difference for those of you who know what that means. Very unlikely to occur by chance, right at the stroke of midnight. And then it settles back and goes doing its normal thing again. So what that tells us is something about the engagement of a lot of people changes aspects of the physical world, which we see through these random number generators, which again is saying that, in this case, either photons or electrons are responding in some way to a large moment of coherent human consciousness. And the way to test that last bit is I separated the time zones into ones with large populations versus small populations. So if you just do that on 12 and 12 time zones, 6.7 billion people are in 12 time zones, and 600 million are in the other 12 time zones. Not surprisingly, it's over the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, there aren't too many people. Over the US, North and South America, and over Europe and Asia, there's a lot of people. So you do that split and you say, what do you get? Well, you get a significant result where a lot of people are, and you get a similar result, but not as strong in the time zones where there aren't very many people. So then people say, well, what about the whales and the fish? And I would say, well, they don't go by the Gregorian calendar, so we don't know when their celebrations are, so I don't know how to look at it. But maybe they would show something too, we just don't know.
Got to find the whale New Year.
Some kind of whale celebration, but it has to be in every time zone in order to get enough data and repeat every year at about the same time, because people have said, well, have you looked at the Chinese New Year's? A lot of people, probably over 1 billion, celebrate that, but it doesn't happen every day, or it doesn't happen the same day every year, and sometimes it doesn't even happen at the same time. So it's not a good event to use for this kind of a test. So if you're interested, I'm going to put in the chat here, gcp2.net. So gcp2.net is our second generation version of this experiment. The first one we had at a peak 75 random number generators scattered around the world. This one already has over 1,000. And we're moving to build it up so we can end up with 4,000 random number generators of a new design, which allows us to look not just at the bits, but to look at the actual noise itself.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating. John, was there anything you wanted to ask, Dean?
No, not really. I think it's all work. Let me just see how our field here is a Course in Miracles. And a miracle would fit into your category here as something that's different or unusual or outside of the normal. What do you see a miracle as? Let's say, well, let me not prejudice what I was about to say. Let me just throw that out.
A miracle? A
Yeah.
miracle is something that we don't have a good explanation for yet.
Well, we do know, for example, that obviously, class I was just teaching this last week, I was talking a little bit about Christian Science, about the power of the mind and the ability to heal the body. I mean, the Course says if the mind can heal the body, but the body can't heal the mind, then obviously the mind is the stronger thing. So is there any idea of what is happening in that process of the mind healing a body in some instances, but not being able to in other instances? Or does that make sense?
Well, some of the healing will take place. We would call it a placebo effect, which is very powerful. But sometimes unconsciously, you may not want to be healed.
Yes.
Right. So unconscious, by definition, we don't know what's going on. But there's enormous amount of information out there and
Right.
experiences that say that we do have an unconscious place that we generally are not aware of. And sometimes it's in accordance with our conscious wishes, and sometimes it's not. So my example on the role of the unconscious is, I know I shouldn't eat cookies, but I like cookies. So if there are cookies within arm's reach, I will find myself unconsciously reaching over and getting a cookie, and I'll actually pick it up. And sometimes I will notice that and prevent myself from eating the cookie, but not always.
Yeah.
Like I'm working on the computer and I notice, oh, there's a cookie over there. I will get one, I will pick it up and I'll put it in my mouth and start eating it until I realize, oh, what did I just do? I don't
Yeah.
want to eat that cookie.
Right.
My body or something, my unconscious wants a cookie, and
That's
it
right.
overrides my conscious ability. So millions of examples like that in
Yeah,
everybody.
I know. Yeah. If you may know about Anita Morjani's story, for example, she was gone. I mean, dead practically, and for some amazing reason, she turned around and came back to her body and back to life again. I mean, it's just incredible story, but without a real religious foundation completely. Anyhow, it's fun watching all this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm asked sometimes, even by my colleagues, do you think we will ever have a scientific explanation for these kinds of things? Will we ever have it? And so as a scientist, I would say, yeah, because I look at the history of science, and the whole history of knowledge has been that it's gods and spirits and supernatural whatever. And as time goes on, more and more of that we begin to understand in a way that we understand enough to be able to turn into technology. Whether the technology is good or bad is an independent question, an important question, but it's different than we understand enough to be able to do this stuff with it. So can we do that with things that were traditionally considered to be supernatural? I would say yes. And sometimes it's very slow because it takes an enormous amount of money. It takes pushing against status quo, pushing against sometimes religious objections. Like the kind of work I do, I'm sometimes accused of doing demonic work. And just say, well, like statistics is demonic? Really? And experimental work is demonic? I'm working with little instruments here. I don't see any demons. But nevertheless, that surprisingly large percentage of people really get quite upset about that. So
Well, at least you're not working in the Middle Ages.
yeah, in the Middle Ages, I don't know what I would have been, but maybe
Good.
an alchemist. But alchemists in the Middle Ages had deep underground hidden
Yeah,
things where
yeah.
they were working on stuff. I visited one that was 800 years old in Prague. Uh,
Oh,
yeah,
so, so
yeah.
did I.
Oh,
Also in
the
Prague, yeah.
Alchemy Museum there
Yeah,
was in the Jewish quarter, which was
yeah,
walled off for a long
yeah,
time. And there's a very nice museum where you can see how
yeah,
people did it. Yeah.
yeah.
How they turn lead into gold.
Well,
Um,
we still don't know if that was true.
I
They
understand.
made a lot of tinctures. I have one of those tinctures somewhere. Like they get it in like little gold things like this.
Oh,
um,
cool. So a couple questions in chat. This is about remote viewing. Can you comment on Russian experiments in remote viewing?
hmm.
Uh, if I remember correctly, the experiments were discontinued due to some startling results.
If there were startling results, there's no way in the world they would be stopped. No
Right.
way. They might become
Right.
classified and
Uh-huh.
disappear from view, but there is no way, I can guarantee, there's no way that an interesting result is stopped.
Right.
Well, we did know during the Stargate program, when we were doing our own remote viewing program, the Russians had a much bigger program. Our viewers were mostly Army people, and they were viewing from Fort Meade, which is near the NSA. The Russians would train the remote viewers, they would select and train remote viewers, and then they would go to the front, like in Afghanistan and Chechnya. They'd take the remote viewers to the front because they felt that the viewers would be able to do their job better at the front lines, because they were more engaged with it. So our people, when we learned that, we were saying, you don't need to go there. You go there in your mind, right? And you don't have to worry about a bomb falling on you. So it showed a cultural difference about this. The Russian remote viewers were combat trained, essentially. Ours were many also were combat trained, but now they were working in a building in Fort Meade, quite different.
Yes, and remote viewing did, on the public level, stop, but it did go underground after that, as it went from remote viewing to remote influencing. I don't know if you have any insights to that.
Yeah, we at least in the Stargate program when I was there, and pretty sure afterwards, there wasn't much interest in remote viewing for military or intelligence purposes. We did do studies on the feeling of being stared at, which is an analog of distant healing, to see whether you're paying attention to somebody at a distance would affect their physiology. And so the answer is yes. You can affect somebody's physiology at a distance. Can you affect it to the point where it would be useful from a military perspective, which is like the movie The Men Who Stare at Goats.
Mm-hmm.
The concept was that you could stare at a goat and kill it. You could stop
Right.
its heart. Based on the results of the experiments that I've seen, that is pretty unlikely to be able to do something at that level. You can push physiology, for sure. You could also calm it. You can push it or calm it, either way. But we decided, or somebody decided, it wasn't my decision, but it was decided in this program to stick with espionage and not influence. That was not true for the Russians. The Russians
Right.
were working on influence. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a question in chat, and I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but is there any correlation between the shift in scientific research about psychic elements and virtual reality?
Well, there are people who are proposing that we live in a simulation.
Right.
Virtual reality is a
Simulation
simulation.
hypothesis. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, like Don Hoffman from UC Irvine has been one of the proponents of this, and Tom Campbell is another. My view on it is that when you look historically at the ways that people have tried to explain these kinds of phenomena, they would take whatever was the currency in science at the time. So if you go back 100 years ago, all of this was explained by the fourth dimension. which was suddenly a hot topic because, oh, there's more than 3 dimensions. Okay.
Right.
So it was all 4th dimension. And then for a while it was like steam engines. We'll use steam engines as a metaphor because look at the power you can do. You sort of translate from one form of energy into another form of energy. So that's been going on forever. So what's contemporary? Well, quantum mechanics, computer simulations, AI, we'll jump to those because the metaphors are pretty good, but there's still not an explanation. I mean, we can't have an explanation for these kinds of phenomena until we actually understand what consciousness is. And so what's interesting in science is, for a long time, all we thought is that humans were conscious. And then, okay, animals are conscious too. Well, now plants and insects are conscious. And so this is part of this push towards panpsychism at minimum. Well, everything is conscious. It has some form of consciousness. And from there, stepping from there to full-blown idealism is not a big step.
Right.
So, the arrow is pointing back towards this ancient idea about consciousness, which has been around forever.
From a faith perspective, it is God is in everything I see.
Yeah, I would just rephrase that from my perspective. Consciousness is in everything, seen or unseen.
Yes.
It's part of it's
all there is consciousness.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So interestingly, you also hear oftentimes then that that love is all. Everything is love. But then I get confused because I say, well, love is, as we experience, is an emotion, mostly. So how does that link? Where does the consciousness and love link come together? Because they're often paired in a way that I don't completely understand, unless it's gravity, right? Love is a kind of a gravity.
Love is a kind of gravity.
Yeah.
My perspective on the love and consciousness piece is that when you touch that space, when you're still enough and you're in that fairly neutral space, the connection is so profound because it's kind of touching as much as a human can our origins, and that's like what we are. So there's this sense of connection to kind of your essence that's experienced that way. So that's how I look at the consciousness love connection, that it's a sense of recognition of, so to speak, connecting with home for the first time in a way, as a witness in a different state of awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Have you done much work with synchronicities, Dane?
No, I missed that. I was looking at the chat.
Oh, okay. I just said, have you done much work with synchronicities?
Well, as I said, all of my experiments are synchronicities.
All of them?
Well, yeah. I mean, they're arranged coincidences that have meaning to them. I typically, as the experimenter, I bring the meaning, and the meaning evokes a correlation in a context. Very similar to at least Jung's idea of a synchronicity. And the Global Consciousness Project is a perfect example of that, because we're seeing synchronicities between large-scale collective awareness and the behavior of the physical world, right? We don't have a good explanation, at least we don't have a good materialistic explanation as to how that could happen.
All right.
And we know by design that it's not because of electromagnetic effects, and it's not due to a long list of mundane reasons why that would happen. One of the most perplexing issues in this is when you take a random number generator. Let's see if I have a different kind. I think this is a one. Yeah. So some of the ones that we use is just this little stick. This is called True RNG. It's a little memory stick type of thing. Produces really, really good random bits. Forget how many, like 100,000 a second, something like that. So it's quite a good instrument. So these are the kinds of things that we have around the world. But the output of this thing is that you want it to make sure that it's not sensitive to temperature, it's not sensitive to magnetic fields, to electromagnetic pulses, all of that stuff. So there's a logical element in it called a exclusive OR. So the random bits that are being produced are sent through this logical gate, this XOR gate, that flips it every other bit. That's not exactly how it works, but I don't need to go into the details. The point of it is that the actual random source, the electronic source, is then logically flipped to do what the cryptologists would say is whitening the data. It guarantees that the bits are independent and that they're distributed equally, 50% zeros and ones. So then the question is, well, what's affecting what? Why would a whole bunch of minds who do not know that they're in an experiment cause the noise level inside this thing to change in such a way that could survive the bit flipping process? This doesn't make any conventional sense at all.
Right.
But the random generators are built that way specifically so it's not responsive to temperature changes or vibration or any other thing. So it's really, really, really random as best as we can tell, except not when you bring humans involved.
Those humans.
Yeah, and not just humans. I see somebody asked about animals. There have been a lot of studies with animals as well. And so what we're talking about here is not human centric. It seems to be more about sentient centric. Consciousness goes all the way up and all the way down. And these same kinds of phenomena can be seen in anything that is sentient.
Well, one could define sentience as an aspect of consciousness that's self-aware.
Yeah, yes. It's not clear what that would feel like. Like if you're a photon and you have consciousness and even self-consciousness.
Right.
I don't know what that would be, but
Maybe
I can't
it's just,
even.
woohoo, we're going really fast.
Well, from our perspective, from their perspective, they can cross the entire universe with no time at all.
That's true.
Yeah. So it's more like,
Totally,
what is
right.
the awareness or the consciousness of a flea? Well, I see Brooklyn you have your hand raised.
Did you want to ask a question or a comment, Lynn?
Yes, thank you. This is amazing.
Oops, you've just been muted again.
You muted, honey.
I just want to thank you so, so much. We're walking each other home. And it's the ego is associated with the parts that doesn't want to change, that fight for their life. They don't want to know, and they know everything. They'd rather be happy. They'd rather be right than happy. And here, Holy Spirit, we're getting deeper and deeper from different ways. Oh my God. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thanks, Lynn.
So I
So-
see other questions here. Where can we get copies of the slides? Yes, I'll send it to whoever, Bud or
You
Keith.
send it to me and I'll forward it to all the attendees.
Okay, another person
Thank
said,
you.
how do we contact you? So I'll put my email there. That's my email.
Thank you. Yeah, and if you go back a little bit, there's a couple of questions as well. And what is your experience or awareness of the connection between psychic abilities and phenomena and psychedelic research or psychedelic therapy?
Yeah, there's definitely a connection. I once spoke with, now I'm forgetting his name, Roland, who was the one at Johns Hopkins, who was so famous for this?
Roland Griffiths.
Yes, Roland Griffiths. So
Griffiths.
I spoke with him and his group because they noticed in their studies of psilocybin that people reported very strong evidence for telepathy. And they wanted to know, well, if we were going to study this, they're already at that time, and still somewhat, that it's controversial. They didn't want to mix two controversies together because it could explode. But they wanted to do it in-house quietly. And so I said, well, with experienced people, you could do a presentiment kind of experiment, because then you're not asking them to consciously do anything. You're just measuring their physiology and presenting very gentle stimuli, like a light flash. And then you'd be able to see whether are their minds actually expanded through space and time, because that's oftentimes what they say. For telepathy, you can do something similar to that. You have two people keep each other in mind and you poke one and you see the other one flinch, essentially. So they may have done those studies, but they said right from the beginning, we're not going to publish it. I mean, this is already so controversial that we don't want to get, you can't mix things.
Yeah, psychedelic on top of psychic. Yeah, that's a combo.
And now all of that mixed in with UFOs too. So because of the consciousness related aspect of the way that the UAP UFOs respond. I mean, people who say that they've had contact will oftentimes say that they're not speaking English to us, but we know what they're saying. It's just, appears in your head. So it's some form of telepathy. So for many, many years, quietly within the Institute of Noetic Sciences, because our founder was an astronaut, and many of the astronauts have had all kinds of weird experiences, including our founder, we talked about this whole thing, or ETs and UFOs and all that, and what do we do with that? And we made a decision, we're not going to talk about it publicly, because it's like a binary bomb. Each one by itself is bad, but together they're really explosive. So we've changed that now. So it puts us in a more, it's somewhat risky, but it's a lot less risky now, because as soon as the topic shows up in the New York Times and is not immediately laughed at, we know, okay, we can come out of the closet, at least on that. The same with psychedelics. So there's an overlap here. And by the way, now it's also AI. So you have AI, psychedelics, UFOs, psychic phenomena are all part of a cauldron that most of which has been hidden for a long time, but they're now poking out of the cauldron and have become visible, and they are all related. And so we haven't exactly figured out how to deal with all of this, other than we're paying attention to it. And the TV series that I mentioned, we are definitely going to have those elements in there. So we'll be able to use fiction to talk about things that we're not quite ready to talk about as fact.
So we do have a few standard questions that we ask all of our mystics. Are you interested in going through that with us?
Sure.
That'd be great. So here we have our first question is really, the theme is about your spiritual path. So how or when do you experience a connection with the divine?
Well, my spiritual path is what a yogi might say is jhana. It's a push towards creativity and knowledge acquisition. That, as long as I can remember, that's simply the way that I am. For me, experiencing the divine, I would say, I wouldn't use the word divine, but I would say that the closest would be when I do an experiment that has an astoundingly good result. That's a period of Archimedes would have said eureka. It's a moment of awe, which is probably the way that many people experience the divine. It's a moment of awe that reflects something about the nature of reality and our role in it. That says we really don't understand as much as science thinks we do. There's a lot left to go. So that's how I experience it.
Yeah, you've answered that, basically the next point then, of how do you experience it. Did you want to add anything else to that?
Well, so a lot of it has to do with an awe response. But the other one is that I've also been a meditator a long time, and occasionally, rarely, I will get into that place where you're completely inside some sort of a saffron-colored light. And it's extremely peaceful. It has elements of bliss, all of that. So I've been meditating on and off since I was 20 or so 50 years. And I can say that maybe the total amount of time that I've experience that kind of thing spontaneously always is maybe 2 minutes. It's not something I can evoke, but when it happens, I can feel it starting to happen. I can certainly feel what it's like inside that. I would like to stay in that a long time because that's very, very pleasant. And it's probably as close to what a mystic would say is bliss. It's that state. But it's for
Yes,
me, it's been rare.
that is the goal of every mystic, because that is that mystical moment, that mystical experience. John wrote a beautiful book about it, by the way, if you're really interested, on mysticism, on what is mysticism. And that definition of how a mystic experiences that connection is very universal and very ephemeral. You can't even put words to it after a while. It becomes
I've also
experiential.
I've been in the presence of the Dalai Lama and several other highly evolved people. And I can feel, I think most people can, but I can certainly feel that they are radiating something quite different than
Yes.
other people. I mean,
Yes.
if there's such a thing as radiating goodness, which is one of the yogic siddhis, by the way, they can do it. So one time I was at a conference, and one of the Brahma Kumaris are led by 3 women. So one of the women, I think she's passed away, but her name was Dadi Janki, the 3 women in charge of Dadis. So Dadi Janki was going to give a talk at this thing, so we're all sitting in the audience. And I felt, before I knew what was happening, I felt that my sense of 3-dimensionality, or spatial sense, was actually turning. It was like distorted and turning back towards behind me, to my left. And so I went with it because I didn't know what that was. It just felt strange. It turned and I saw it was her. She had just entered the room, and that spatial distortion went along with her as she was walking up to the stage. So she's a tiny lady, like a little dumpling of a lady. So she walked up there, but something is like a white dwarf star, enormous amount of gravitational pull. And that's kind of what it felt like. It felt like my gravitational space had been pulled literally towards her as she went up on the stage. That was quite strange. So some people, yeah, they have it and you can feel it.
That's wonderful. And yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. So here's an interesting one. What challenges have you had on your mystical path?
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure. There's social pressure. There's economic pressure to not do this. Fortunately, I've inherited a sense where being an iconoclast is actually a good thing. That's what every creative person faces. And so my dad was a sculptor. He also had a number of college degrees and a law degree, and he was very accomplished, but he made his living as an artist. And so his art was very similar to Rodin. It was that style.
Wow.
And he also did some more modern art. But it was from watching him and hearing him talk about it that if you're going to go into a creative business, whatever that was, you're just going to get criticism all the time. You're extremely lucky if people begin to appreciate what you've done while you're still alive. And fortunately, because I picked that up, I figured, well, it's much more interesting for me to do what I find interesting rather than worry what other people think about it. Because if I did worry about social acceptance, there's no way in the world I would have done this. So it requires a combination of iconoclast plus curiosity, and that's what I have.
So what do you love about your path?
No.
I get paid for doing what I want to do. Right? I'm a scientist. I get paid to do science on these kinds of topics. So this is one of the reasons why not only have I not retired, in a sense I can't retire. Because then, well, what would I do? I would continue doing exactly the same stuff, except I wouldn't be paid. So why should I stop? So that's what I do.
I feel that.
100%.
And what about your own spiritual practice? Do you have a spiritual practice that you do on a regular basis?
I would say that the meditation that started this Seeker's Compass, we do that for all of our meetings at IONS. So we always have an opening practice of some type. Lots of a huge range of different kinds of practices, but every meeting always starts that way. So that becomes part of my practice because I have meetings constantly. I used to do a pretty diligent meditation practice every day. I don't do it as much as I used to, partially because I feel that the way that I work is kind of a spiritual practice. It's not meditating per se, but I spend 6 to 10 hours a day doing stuff mentally, mental focus. Again, it's not the same. It's because a lot of it is analytical, but not all of it is. I mean, sometimes you pause and go into a different state to just ponder a problem I'm working on or something else. So I would say it's different than the way it used to be. It's partially just from age that I feel I don't feel the pull as I used to when I was younger to do daily meditation, for example. And it's partially because I kind of get it anyway as part of my job. So sort of it's I don't know if it's okay to say that your job is to meditate.
It can be.
Well, it sort of is now because it's just the nature of my work. Every meeting starts with a meditation. So, okay, there it is.
Yeah, I get that. I understand that completely. So thank you. These are all of our questions, other than how someone might find out more, and you've already shared that. So plus, I put a link in chat to your books on Amazon.
Yeah, and then here's
so
my
people
website.
can take a look at that.
Here's my website.
And also in your book, Real Magic, you talk about Gatsai, and that's a pretty cool little website that you've spun up as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. And with that, I would like to say thank you for everyone joining us. Thank you, Dean. We really appreciate all the insights that you've shared with us today. It has been amazing and wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.